This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett. Ahead of us today on this Monday's programming, we have from Iowa State University, Lee Schulz providing this week's commentary on the cattle market. He discusses the latest U.S. beef export numbers and what they mean to cattle price trends, as well as the latest data from the Consumer Price Index and how it relates to consumer beef demand. Also ahead, Joel DeRouchey of K-State University provides listeners with tips on cleaning cattle feeding areas after experiencing rainy conditions, as well as the importance of prioritizing those areas to help lower fly numbers. Ahead on this week's Wildlife Management segment, K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerkin discusses the positive aspects of having turtles around farm ponds, as well as species of turtles to be aware of. All that and more today on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett from the K-State Radio Network, and today we have with us Dr. Joel DeRouchey from K-State University. He's our Livestock Extension Specialist. Dr. DeRouchey, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Samantha, for having me on, and we certainly are excited about your role here at Agriculture Today and look forward to working with you for many years to come.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. So from what I understand, we've got some concerns for feedlot surfaces at this point with some of the rain we've had coming in parts of Kansas.
Yeah, so we've certainly been blessed recently with some rains, some well-needed rains in many parts of Kansas. And one of the areas that we need to be considering with our livestock operations is the amount of mud and the amount of muck that can come from this. And this is whether it's a small operation with just a few head or a large feedlot situation or a dairy. And what we just want to be cognizant of is how we provide those animals with the best pen surface possible, regardless if it's when it was dry. But now that we've had all this moisture, making sure that we're not decreasing our performance of our animals.
Absolutely. So there's two things here really that producers should be keeping in mind. What are those?
One of the things, so depending on the producer, if you were feeding cattle over the winter and spring, and then those lots are now empty because those cattle either got sold or they're out on grass, what we want to do with those stagnant pens that are empty is get in and clean and get those groomed. And basically there we're just trying to pull the manure out of the areas that have accumulated, making sure any areas where we want to have drainage, it's able to do that, and then get that manure removed from those pens and potentially then be able to use that as a fertilizer source. And some were able to do that before spring planted, or some will do that after wheat harvest to get that manure out to be used as a fertilizer source. The other good time for this is when the pens are empty, is if you utilize mounds for the fall and winter to have those cattle be able to get up and out of those low areas when it does get additional moisture during those times. It's a good time to repack those mounds, rebuild them so they effectively can be used for cattle or even your dairy heifers, replacements during that time of year. So again, think about removing manure and building mounds in those cases. The other type of operation is really the continuous feeder. So even if we were feeding during the winter and spring and now there's additional cattle or new cattle or even the existing ones that were fed, no doubt those pens got very muddy and mucky the last couple weeks in particular in a number of places in Kansas. And so what we're wanting to do is once we get some dryness in those pens, then we want to go in and do the same thing we just talked about in terms of pulling the extra manure, getting drainage back to where it needs to go to have those pens effectively drained so they dry faster for us here in the summer.
And if producers aren't wanting to wait around for it to dry, what are some of the concerns if they're not going to let those pens dry?
Yeah, because one of the things that often happens is all of a sudden the pens are really muddy. We want to get in and clean. One of the problems with that is that we often take a lot of soil when we try and clean when the pens are really muddy. Now, there could be places, especially along bunk lines or if you have concrete bunk lines or just behind, we know that that's a high accumulation of manure. So those would be good places to still go in and try and get some of that out to decrease that manure. But in pens in general, when that surface gets soft, we often have where those cattle's feet are working not only manure but the soil. And if we get in too aggressive, then we're starting to pull a lot of soil out. And then those operations know that they're at some point going to have to bring soil back in to pack that surface. Otherwise, we just have large erosion areas.
Right, and add an expense that really no one wants to deal with, really, in terms of everything else going on in the world right now.
That's right. It's just something that we want to minimize the labor involved and minimize the expense, but also it's very important that we get the manure removed, especially those that are feeding cattle in those operations, because of one of the things is the fly production that can begin to occur. Flies really like a moist area that also has organic matter, and manure and rain is a perfect combination for fly larvae to be produced. And so one of the consequences of having these wet, mucky pens and not getting them clean and dried in a timely fashion is the extra production of flies that occur. And we know that flies have certainly a negative effect on our animal performance in dry lots or even cattle out grazing. And so, again, just from a sanitation standpoint, we can get reduced fly numbers this summer as well.
In terms of, you've already mentioned the mounds being a strategy for cleaning. There's some added benefit of using that for fertilizer as well.
Yeah, so obviously manure is it's been our decades and decades long renewable fertilizer source that many operations capture the value of. And certainly with the costs of inorganic fertilizer today, we want to make sure that we're getting the most out of that manure that is being produced in our livestock operations and utilized as a fertilizer source. And again, for many operations, if they've already planted their spring crops, they got wheat to be harvested, there's not necessarily a place to go with that manure, and that's just fine. Ultimately, what we want to do is get it stacked up, get it in a location that we can then get to it once we have available acreage to apply that manure out onto, because again, it's a highly renewable resource. Anybody with livestock knows that it's a valuable fertilizer and it helps benefit crop production long term over ground that has never had manure prior. And so we want to make sure we're utilizing that resource, because ultimately it's the byproduct of the feed that never got digested, and we have a high cost in the feed going into animals. Thus, then we can capture on what was not digested and fully utilized by the livestock.
And you mentioned this is a busy time of year, certainly for producers across the state, but this should definitely be on a priority list as well.
Absolutely. And, it's just part of the routine management. We can get busy and put priority in other areas because this isn't one of the most fun activities to do. But clearly it has an economic impact for the performance of the cattle. Certainly as we get into dairies, and our dairy specialists would speak much more to this, but as we want to keep the sanitation, somatic cell counts, all the things that are important for having a highly sanitized area that those dairy cows or replacement heifers are developing in.
In terms of concerns for runoff in some of these feedlot situations, is that a concern here for producers?
Yeah, as we look at the runoff potential of any environmental concerns, if a facility is a CAFO, which is a large feeding operation, all the runoff of those would be contained in lagoons and then put through center pivots or other methods of disposal onto our crop ground as a fertilizer source. For some of our small feedlots or smaller feeding facilities, they may or may not have any retention or things in place that filter out some of the runoff that comes off. So from an environmental standpoint, absolutely. The more that we can pull off and groom those feedlot surfaces, certainly runoff still occurs, but our potential to have phosphorus, nitrogen, other nutrients leave that facility are much less because we pulled the manure off and really got down closer just to having soil left rather than manure potentially leave through runoff.
So if we have listeners tuning in that aren't producers that have feedlots per se, but are still cow-calf, maybe even some stocker operations, is this a consideration for them as well?
Yes, and one of the good practices that we have in those type of operations is we often have winter feeding areas, and we often talk about them being kind of the sacrificial areas in a pasture or next to some facilities that we put in winter feeding lines, some hay rings, whatever that a producer may do to provide supplemental feed during the winter months when there's not green grass and additional grazing potential available. Well, those areas as well build up in manure and organic matter from wasted feed or wasted hay. In fact, we did a number of research. It's been almost over 15 years ago here at K-State where we looked at just a single hay ring. And if we look at keeping that and not cleaning that from when we got done with that hay ring in April and May and left it throughout the summer. The fly production still occurs all summer long through those. We have a perfect environment for that fly production, as well as then we just don't get anything to grow back in those areas. So a very good practice for our cow-calf producers is in those winter feeding site areas, whether it's just simply bunk lines or whether if they were using hay rings to feed round bales, is to go in and get all that cleaned and mounded up. It can compost a little bit. A lot of our producers don't have manure spreaders, but what we still can do with those is still push that manure up. It'll compost down oftentimes our winter feeding areas, especially if you had a hay ring. If you push it up, you're going to lose well over half the volume of that total manure if it composts over the summer. And then, you still retain the phosphorus, the potassium, a lot of our micronutrients that then can be used to be spread out on agronomically to be used as a fertilizer source. And so for our cow-calf producers that maybe fight pink eye, we certainly want to decrease the amount of flies in particular in those particular areas, thus having proper sanitation of all areas around there that maybe were used for feeding site areas during the winter or spring is important as well, so we don't prolong fly development over the course of the summer.
Sure, and this goes for areas where calving has been going on as well, right?
Yeah, so this is both if we were out having cows calve in field settings where we had individual feed areas, or if they were using more in a confined area. The same principle applies to both. We have additional manure, we have additional feed that was wasted or simply not consumed by the animals. Those areas would provide perfect breeding grounds for fly production. And anything we can do, even just to scrape and mound it up, has a significant impact in producing less flies if we scrape and mound it versus just leaving it flat and allowing that fly production to happen over the course of the summer.
That was Dr. Joel DeRouchey, one of our livestock extension specialists here at K-State University. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. With us is Lee Schulz, an extension livestock economist out of Iowa State University. And today he will be providing us with our weekly cattle market update. Thank you, Lee, for being with us.
Thanks for having me again.
Like I mentioned, this is our cattle market update segment of today's programming. So we're going to do a quick recap of the cattle market, what it looked like last week, and what it has for us ahead. So, Lee, let's start with the review of the last week behind us. What did our cattle market have for us this past week?
Overall, pretty positive week. We've seen futures prices were up anywhere from $1 to $2, depending on what contract we look at. Some relative strength in cash prices. We still see that the spread between the north and the south. Here in the north, we've seen prices in that 142 to 143 range. South, we were in the upper 130s on that cash basis. To give you some perspective, a year ago, we were trading in the 120 range for live cattle prices. Really, when in feeder cattle, there I think it was kind of a steady week. And really reacting to the much higher corn prices we've seen overall.
Sure. And then in terms of box beef trade, what did we see this past week?
Well, I think we're seeing the topping of the box beef as we would expect seasonally here, as we're really kind of in that ramping up the summer grilling season, and now we expect to kind of get in some of those dog days of summer as we get into the next several months. I would expect this to see some stair-stepping lower as we get into the box beef trade. Now, we've seen rather robust slaughter levels, and I think that is helping continue to hold some of those prices where they're at. Obviously, that's trickling through into fed cattle prices. So again, I'd summarize it as a pretty positive week. If we look back a couple weeks, I think the optimism has certainly improved.
So on the up and up for sure in terms of some of these markets and their values. We've got some new data coming in terms of the consumer price index data. So what does that mean for us when we're thinking of these box beef trade markets that we just discussed? What does that mean for the demand of beef right now?
Well, when I look at CPI that was just released last week, and it's the May data, and so we are always lagged in looking at that data. So realizing that a lot of the higher gas prices we've seen the last couple of weeks wouldn't be fully captured in some of those CPI numbers for May. But as we look at CPI for year over year, changes was up 8.6%. To give you some perspective, this is the highest since December 1981. So we're really kind of in uncharted territory as it relates to kind of recentness as we look at some of those levels. It was a slight tick higher than the previous month. And so, inflation continues to be the story. When we focus in on looking at meats in particular, that was up 12.3% year over year. That's a slightly lower than the April year-over-year increase. So I'm not ready to say that we're starting to see these prices lower, but maybe we're starting to see a little bit of stabilization there. Now, realizing that, demand's not impacted by the prices that consumers are paying for those particular products. And I would say, a positive signal for demand is, remember, it's what consumers are able and willing to pay. And so far, so good. They've been really willing to pay these higher prices. And so, what I think a real barometer for demand is going to be here as we get into the next several months. We know that demand's really strongest as we're in these, ramp up to Memorial Day and post-Memorial Day into Father's Day, and you'll get a little bit of kick as you get into 4th of July, but after that, we got a long period into Labor Day. And so I think that's going to be the real litmus test of what demand is and how much of that strength continues to go forward.
While we're talking about new data just came out in terms of beef exports as well. So a busy time for you economists for sure. But these were encouraging reports that we saw here, right?
This export data, this is what I like to refer to as more the official data. So this was out of USDA and summarized greatly by U.S. Meat Export Federation. And it's just the summary through April so far, so the first 4 months of the year. But again, another really positive signal there. Exports were up 3% in April year over year from volume. It soared even higher at 33% by value. So when we think about demand, remember it's both the quantity and the price. Certainly price is driving a big part of that demand as we look at exports and as we look at our domestic product. The April data, that's not going to capture some of these COVID restrictions that we've seen in China. Certainly China's been a real star market, and I think that's something to watch as we get export data from May, June, and so forth of how much of that demand is impacted. I like to also pair that against our weekly data, which is through the first week in June, and there it shows, that we're still holding 3% higher year to date in those exports. Now, I will note that as you look at the WASDE data that was also released last week, for the year, they have us about similar to 2021 levels. So that's noting that I think, we will see from a year-over-year standpoint, less of the increases that we've seen so far this year. But overall, this is a positive story for exports, that we're holding these record levels that we've seen in 2021, even at these much higher prices that are being paid by our export customers.
Sure, and we'll talk more later this week on that WASDE report. We'll give a little bit more of an in-depth explanation here with another guest, Guy Allen. But in terms of, we're seeing the headline that's partnering with this beef export data is, another $1 billion month. So really, when producers hear that, what should that mean to them?
I like to boil it down to a number that the U.S. Meat Export Federation calculates. And so they calculate an export value generated, and they put it on a per head basis or a per steer basis. And their last calculation was $489.59. This was the second highest on record. So if you just do some quick math, a steer is maybe about $1,680, $1,700. That's 30% of the value. It shows you of that export market. And so realizing how important that export market is, the growth in that export and maintaining that demand is very critical to the prices. As we look at the next several years of those tighter supplies, we're going to expect to see those higher prices being paid, and that's going to generate that higher value that's allowing us to see the increased prices for the steers.
Sure, some positive takeaways for sure coming from these markets. And then as we think to the future, we're going to be feeding more grain here to our cattle here in the future soon. So grain markets are for sure a concern, but specifically corn potentially having some negative conditions that it's growing in with some, drought considerations being taken into account. What can we anticipate as a result of that?
Well, I would extend that to more just weather challenges. So certainly we had some delayed plantings. We did get a lot planted, and crop progress has certainly improved year to date here. But I think, there's been some cooler weather, some, emergence issues. In this part of the world, we've seen some flooding that's really impacted some of those acres of corn planted. So I think there's certainly some challenges that are currently existing and certainly going to exist going forward. You don't have to look any further than looking at the futures prices of where those corn markets are, right? Those are both supply related as we talk about some of these challenges, but also demand related, that we have relatively large inventories of animals, and that feed demand, export demand, all of that is continuing to be really strong and giving us these high values. To distill what this means, when you look at cost of production, cost of gain, those are again, in some uncharted territory we've seen here in those values for producers. So what does that mean kind of short term? I think we are seeing much lighter weights of cattle. And certainly because those last few pounds, they're less efficient to put on, and you're putting it on at $7 corn, that's impacted producers' willingness or ability to do that. So that's the short-term fix. Longer-term challenge is, those are much higher costs of gain over all those pounds. That's going to make it much, much more costly for producing those animals. It's going to obviously impact break-evens and profitability for producers.
So you mentioned some short-term outlook. So in terms of final thoughts on anticipating the week ahead, what do you have for us, Lee?
Well, I think when you look at where we're at, this June strength is pretty atypical relative to where we were in May and the strength we've seen. So I think it gives me a much more positive outlook, at least for this summer, than I would have told you a couple of weeks ago. Now, certainly last week's trade was a big part of that, and some of the appreciation in those values certainly helped that. But realizing there's some really good fundamentals here. I think even though we have record inventories of cattle on feed, they are rather current. And so that's certainly helping the market. And the ability to operate these processing plants at a rather brisk pace has really helped. Now, demand is really pulling those cattle, I think, through the system, and the reason why we've seen those brisk rates. But realizing that, I think we're seeing a rather positive outlook. There's a lot of pieces that need to come into place, but I think, we've certainly seen those values improve from what we've seen a couple of weeks ago.
Well, with an explanation of the market from the week behind us, as well as anticipated thoughts on maybe what's to come, thank you, Lee, for your time.
Thank you.
That was Lee Schulz, Extension Livestock economist, coming to us from Iowa State University for our weekly cattle market update. More ahead of us on Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. To round out this Monday programming, we have with us K-State Fisheries and Aquatic Extension Specialist, Joe Gerkin, to speak with us about concerns regarding turtles in today's wildlife segment. So we've got some concerns from Kansans across the state in terms of turtles in their ponds.
Yeah, so I've been getting a lot of calls lately about people seeing turtles in their ponds and just thinking that their fish populations are going to crash as a result. So the turtles are going to go out, they're going to eat all the little fish, and there's not going to be any food for bigger fish, and that's really just not the case. So turtles will eat fish, but primarily turtles like to eat aquatic vegetation. And so they're eating submerged plants, which is really good. Those can become a problem. We can get too many of those. They like to eat aquatic bugs that we see, aquatic insects. So that makes up a vast majority of turtle diets, probably 80 to 90%. There might be a little bit, about 10% or so of their diet that they're eating that are fish, but almost always those fish are sick or injured. So remember, turtles are sitting on the bottom primarily waiting for fish to come by, and they're really slow compared to a fish. So if a turtle's going to eat a fish, it's generally sick or injured. And it's good then to get those fish out of the system. So then they're not spreading disease or causing concerns for other fish that we might see in the system.
So they're a benefit to have around, not always a bad guy, as some may expect.
Yep.
So in terms of turtles being around, is there some stocking ability as well?
Sure. So we don't want to stock turtles. We want their numbers to be natural, kind of lower. And if they get too high, that's where we can start to see potentially some issues with them competing with fish for resources, not necessarily eating all the fish because, again, they're too slow. The fish are too fast to eat healthy fish. But if there's too many of them around, it can start to be a concern with them kind of competing for habitat and things like that. So we don't ever want to stock turtles. They'll naturally come into ponds. They're an okay part of that pond as long as they're not disrupting us. So we want them there most of the time.
When do we not want these turtles around?
Sure. So if we were in a small backyard pond setting, for example, where there's a bunch of koi or goldfish, normally in those settings they tend to eat the fish that we don't want them to just because it's such a confined area. So if you start to see them in backyard settings, we would want to get rid of them. Turtles can also spread salmonella, and so it's important when we're talking about irrigating crops that we try to keep turtles out of those systems. And so if you have a pond, especially where you're irrigating from or you're pumping from a well to a pond and then irrigating from that water, you'd want to try to keep turtles out of that area as much as possible.
Just for some health and safety concerns there.
Yep. So a lot of times that salmonella can get sprayed directly onto crops. Spinach is a big one, for example, where it's leafy greens. And then, getting rid of that, just a food safety perspective.
Absolutely. And then in terms of some of the species that we can expect to see, are there some good ones to keep around, some bad ones?
Sure. So red-eared sliders are the most common ones that we see. They have like a little red speck on the sides of their face. They're relatively small, maybe 6 inches in diameter, kind of is normally what we see. Some other species in the area, there's river cooters, there's painted turtles. All of these are smaller turtles. And people think that they're big, scary snapping turtles. And we do have a common snapping turtle around here. And they tend to get a lot bigger and they can be aggressive. And true to their name, they can snap at you and hurt you. So that's a good example where you'd want to reach out to an extension agent or reach out to me and get some help relocating those turtles. They can be dangerous, so I never recommend going out and trying to catch them yourselves.
Absolutely. And in terms of finding more information regarding turtles, what to look out for if someone's not familiar with identifying some of these turtle species, especially snapping turtles, what are some of those resources?
Yeah, so as always, I'd recommend first of all that you reach out to your local natural resources extension agent, and they can help get you on the right track. They have some fact sheets that you can give us. The KSRE, Kansas State Research and Extension Wildlife page can also give you some information. We have some resources there. And as always, feel free to reach out to me, and I can help you directly if there's something there that you need more information about.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for speaking with us today on the importance of turtles and ponds and addressing some of those concerns that people out there in Kansas might have with them. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Samantha. Welcome to K-State.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That's kind of you. That was K-State University's Fisheries and Aquatic Extension Specialist, Joe Gerkin, speaking on turtles and ponds and their potential benefit. That's it from Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network.